Happy Tuesday, Swell. The world as we know it has changed remarkably, especially over the last year from an economic and political context. It was argued in many quarters that the coronavirus specter is going to radically alter the way the world functions. However, there are certain social structures and institutions which have exacerbated the plight of the most vulnerable people and increased the concentration of wealth, which, to be honest, was already the trend before the crisis. I'm joined today by economist and writer Grace Blakey, who has authored two very incisive books. The first one is called Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization. And the second is called The Corona Crash: How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism. Both of these books have a similar thread in the sense that they call into question the legitimacy of the powerful interests which have come to dominate the world. She is also a staff writer for Tribune Magazine, where she hosts a podcast called A World to Win. And it's a podcast that I would highly recommend. Grace, thanks for joining me on Swell, and I want to start by asking you what you make of the state of politics and the economy in Britain and the world today.
Hi, Karan, and thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you on Swell. It's great to be introduced to this new platform, and for your introduction to my work, my podcast, and my books. In answer to your question, what do I make of the state of politics and the economy around the world, and particularly in the UK today? I think, after a decade in which across the world we've had a deep economic stagnation. So ever since the financial crisis, productivity in the global north and in many developing countries as well has not increased as fast as historical averages, and in fact in some cases has stagnated completely. Relatedly, wages have stagnated in the UK. We've had, a decade of wage stagnation in the US. The average worker is about as well off in real terms, in purchasing power terms, as they were in 1979. And inequalities increased. Some countries have managed to kind of escape the low-income trap, but many others remain really stuck. And, the COVID pandemic has just exacerbated all of these issues. We're going to see rising inequality, both within countries and between countries, another debt crisis for the global south, and alongside that, something which I think is really important and stark has been just the erosion of democracy all around the world. I mean, we can see that very clearly in India, but also in the UK, where the response to the pandemic has been met with just all sorts of outright corruption. There's been scandal after scandal after scandal that's hit this government, and yet nothing's been done about it. They're also introducing laws to try and make protest illegal, basically, in the UK. So in some cases, they will be able to just shut down lawful protest. Our media is not holding the powerful to account in any way, shape or form. And you're seeing a shift towards authoritarianism, I think, in a lot of different countries all around the world. And that's obviously at least partly happened because of the threats that come from a fundamentally unstable economic model in which some people have a lot of property, some people have assets, and other people don't. And they're going to want to organize in order to demand an economy that works for everyone, whereas those who have that wealth and have that power are going to want to organize themselves to make sure that their position remains in place. So, yeah, I mean, one big thing that links to that, which I think is worth us talking about more, is this challenge that has been associated with the move towards quite unorthodox monetary policy in the US, the UK, Japan, and Europe, with the rise of asset purchasing programs like what is colloquially referred to as quantitative easing in many of these economies, which has basically allowed central banks to create new money to purchase assets, and has therefore pumped tons and tons of money into the private financial system and pushed up asset prices, whether that's equities in the US, housing in the UK, whatever. And just that has massively increased the wealth inequality between those who own assets and those who don't. And it's really an extension of this problem of financialization, which I wrote about in my first book, which the political foundations of this regime that I refer to as finance-led growth is basically a divide between asset owners and non-asset owners. And if you can convince enough people who own assets to support the status quo, then you have something of a stable economic model. We saw that obviously before the financial crisis. We've seen it after the financial crisis, largely again because of quantitative easing. But that model leaves lots of people out. So if you don't own a house, if you don't have a pension, if you don't have wealth, you're reliant on income from work, and income has stagnated. You may not be able to ever expect to afford to buy a home. You're stuck in the private rented sector, paying a lot of rent. You probably can't save a lot. You might have a lot of debt. And your future is highly uncertain. So I think this is really the problem that we're going to be seeing as we move away from the pandemic, is this idea of a K-shaped recovery in which the top increases their wealth and power and income and potentially creates a kind of boom because they're all going out and spending all their money, whereas the bottom faces more insecurity, more debt, and just lower living standards.
Thanks for covering so much ground in just 4.5 minutes, Grace. I think that's truly remarkable, and you've captured a lot. And I'd love to go back into the inception of quantitative easing as part of the broader neoliberal framework. What were the intended outcomes of financialization as you see it when, they came up with it in the 80s and 90s, and when they imposed these policies across the global north and the global south in equal measure? What was sort of the intention, and what did it actually achieve?
So the rise of the finance sector and financialization along with it happened both because of policy and just changes in the way that capitalism worked. So the policy changes were the deregulation of the banks, in particular, the removal of restrictions on capital mobility, as well as kind of some more specific changes to the way in which the finance sector was regulated, but basically all of which made it easier to create credit in one form or another. At the same time, you had this change in the nature of production where you had these huge multinational corporations, many of whom were had very close relationships with the finance sector. So often they had close relationships with investment banks that would kind of manage their financial affairs for them, manage their, floating on stock markets, support them to borrow, etc. And that those firms increasingly came to act like financial institutions themselves. So they would, increasingly do things like hedge currency risk, make bets on financial markets, acquire all different kinds of assets, acquire kind of, often the stocks and bonds in other corporations. So you started to see this general disintegration of the boundary between finance and the ordinary firm. So that was obviously something that I think just kind of took place as capitalism increased in scale, as capitalism became more centralized. But the policy changes, I think, were designed with a very particular idea in mind, and they were implemented by a set of governments, including Thatcher's in the UK and Reagan in the US, who were very focused on supporting this model of financialized growth and finance-led growth. So kind of removing any barriers to that model being developed, and also kind of shoring up the political foundations for that system, because, that system is associated with rising inequality, with all sorts of kind of political and social problems that might have made it not sustainable over the long run. And so the desire to deregulate banking, to remove restrictions on capital mobility, remove exchange controls, credit controls, was all around creating lots of credit so that the average person in the global north could get a piece of the pie. This whole system of finance-led growth is based on constant increases in asset prices, sometimes based on underlying growth, and sometimes not based on underlying growth, as in, for example, property markets. But the whole point is that, maybe the real economy is not performing particularly well, so capital ends up flooding into finance, real estate, professional services, these sectors of the economy that can kind of apparently create returns out of nowhere. Now, of course, we know that isn't really the case, as we saw during the financial crisis. But the whole aim of, deregulating the financial system was to make sure that those sectors could carry on creating these returns out of nowhere for as long as possible. And the way to do that was obviously, as I said, kind of increasing the amount of credit that could be created in the global economy, which allowed more people to purchase more assets, which allowed companies to do things like buy back their own shares, purchase their own assets, which allowed obviously banks to kind of lend huge amounts to each other as well as to consumers and to firms. And in doing so, that obviously facilitated this boom. It allowed this boom to go on much longer than it otherwise might have, as well as creating a constituency of people, homeowners, people with private pensions, who had this interest in the maintenance of the status quo. If you have assets and those assets are going up in value, then you're going to want things to stay the same so that you carry on getting richer. And that was really, that bargain that existed between the elites and homeowners in the global north is really what has sustained neoliberalism for a very, very long time.
Grace, what really startles me from listening to everything that you just mentioned is this idea of debt. It means different things to different groups of people based on your social location. And I was wondering what you make of the whole situation from the point of view of corporations and everyday people. And it seems that the lessons of 2008 haven't really been learned because we were in a recession even before the pandemic kicked in. And I think you go into this in some detail in your book. But do you see a difference in the power dynamics, or is there a shift that's likely to occur after the pandemic?
Debt is a really interesting relationship, really, because it's a relationship between a debtor and a creditor, obviously. And there's a tendency, I suppose, to talk about debt as though it's always something that is extractive by to the debtor, right? But actually that isn't always the case because, your relationship to debt depends upon your power within the world economy. So if you are a poor, working class, insecurely employed person in the global north, then you might have to take out debt just to be able to make ends meet. If you are a state in the global south, you will have to take out debt to be able to perform basic functions. And often the terms upon which that debt is used, whether that's, for a young person in the global north or for a state in the global south or, anyone with not very much power in the global economy, the terms are often not very good. So you end up paying high rates of interest. But if you are a massive international corporation, then your ability to use debt, to be offered debt, often on very easy terms by large banks and even sometimes by states, can augment your power because it means you can buy other companies, you can invest in certain assets. Similarly, for a wealthy person living in the global north who can access debt in order to buy a new home, maybe buy 2 or 3 houses and rent some of them out. So this relationship of kind of debtor to creditor depends upon class, basically. It depends upon wider, social, political and economic systems that determine your place, your situation in the global economy. And what we have seen in the wake of the financial crisis, and even more so now that we're in the middle of this pandemic, is a massive increase in debt of all kinds. And this has been deliberate. It's the only way to kind of keep the global economy going after 2008, after that huge crisis, was to just pile new debt upon old debt in the hope of encouraging people to go out and spend at the shops, in the hope of encouraging businesses to invest, in the hope of, really just getting the economy going again. The only problem, of course, is that a lot of that debt was not used well. And this is the interesting thing about debt, right? It's that, if you are talking about corporate debt or you're talking about sovereign debt, then if that debt is being used to kind of increase the productive potential of the economy, it's going into research and development, decarbonisation, infrastructure investment, all these things that are required to kind of provide a basic standard of living to the average person and to indeed protect us from climate breakdown, then often, the use of that debt can be a very, very positive thing. The issue is when that debt is used purely for the purposes of augmenting the power and wealth of the debtor and often the creditor as well. payday loans and extractive lending on the part of creditors doesn't help the global economy. It is extractive, even if it helps people who are in a very tight spot. Ultimately, it just means that they're paying huge amounts of interest to rich and powerful organizations. Equally, extremely large increases in corporate debt, for example, that are just used to buy back shares or to buy up other corporations or fund mergers and acquisitions activity, that is really just debt that's being used to augment the power of the already powerful. It's the same with states. States are going to be taking on loads and loads of debt during this pandemic, and a lot of the time they are going to be using that debt simply to give it to big businesses. They're not spending it on often decarbonisation or investment or any of these things that are going to be required to deliver a just recovery from the pandemic. So I don't think that lessons have really been learned. But again, it's less about learning lessons than it is about changing who has the power. Ultimately, the powerful are always going to use their resources, their connections, their abilities to make themselves richer and make themselves more powerful. The question is whether or not working people are able to organise in order to demand a different way of organising the economy and to build a new system. We've seen that in some areas, in some parts of the world. In India, obviously, you had those big strikes recently. But as yet, that hasn't coalesced into a movement that's powerful enough, really, to threaten the interests of those at the very top. But maybe we will see that after the pandemic.
What you mentioned leads me to the larger question of the role of institutions. What do you make of Brexit, especially in light of the elections that took place after? I was of the belief that the Tories are a party of elites and don't really appeal to everyday folks. But it seems that, there were a lot of people who voted Conservative, and this was the case with the Trump presidency as well. A lot of unlikely voters, decided to switch and abandon some of the parties that earlier represented them. Are everyday people, especially in Britain, not resonating with the Labour Party anymore? And, this comes as quite a shocker given the ideas that Jeremy Corbyn stands for.
So that's a really complicated question, and it's more complicated than just saying working class people are now increasingly voting for the Conservatives, because they are. That is largely what allowed Brexit to succeed, was that enough working class people did vote for Brexit. What is often missed in that discussion is that a lot of very wealthy people voted for it too. A lot of the problem comes down to the way that we understand this question of class. Because one thing that did really determine and has determined for a few elections now whether or not you're likely to vote Conservative the most is whether or not you own your own home. Now, there are a lot of people in the regions of the UK who probably think of themselves as working class, but who do own their own homes, who do have some level of security in that asset ownership, in their pensions. They're probably older, they have relatively secure jobs, even if they're not particularly well paid, who really, have some level of status anxiety. So they know that they have something and they want to hold on to that. And the way in which often people make sense of the declining living standards, the declining wages that have been visible since the financial crisis, rather than saying, oh, this is because our economy is not organised and well enough and needs to be changed. Especially if you own your own home, where you think, well, I've got a lot of wealth stored up in that, I don't want it to be taxed, I don't want house prices to go down. You might ascribe blame for that somewhere else. You might say, well, it's because, Europe has done X or Y or Z, it's because migrants have come over and taken our jobs or whatever. And I think that was a big challenge that actually the Labour Party was facing, because, Labour needed those people to vote for it. And a lot of them didn't. A lot of them voted Conservative. A far bigger issue, though, that is a big issue, is the fact that there are kind of middle to low income homeowners in parts of the country who want things largely to stay the same, but with a little bit more for them, rather than identifying with a wider class and thinking that, that whole class needs to be lifted up. Another big issue is just that a lot of working class people in the UK don't vote. So we have, a huge number of people who could vote don't vote. And they're disproportionately likely to be working class. So they just haven't turned out, and that has been in part because those people do not think that there is a party that represents them, because they think that the Labour Party is exactly the same as the Conservative Party. You frequently hear people saying, oh, politicians are all the same. And that has been a trend that we've seen since 1997. And in every election since then, basically, working class people dropping out of the electorate on the basis that there's no one that really represents them. And, you would have thought that the Corbyn moment would have changed that, and it did slightly, because a lot of those people did re-enter the electorate to vote for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. But that trend wasn't big enough to counteract the other really critical trend, which was Brexit. And of course, for a lot of people, even people who perhaps, weren't really, really excited about Brexit when it happened, the idea that political elites in this country were going to work together to basically stop something that the public had voted for from happening, that really spoke to a lot of people's anger with the way that the system was and wasn't working. For a whole bunch of reasons, some of which I've described, some of which I haven't, there has been mounting frustration with the political and economic system in this country, but there hasn't really been much of a route for that frustration to be expressed. So that is it's the main issue. It's the fact that a lot of people are very unhappy with the way that things are, but they don't have a way of expressing that. And another issue is that, there are some people who are maybe seeing their living standards decline, but they're still relatively well off. So there's a kind of, the Conservative Party is working very hard to keep that group of people on its side. The real challenge is making all working people conceive of themselves as part of the same class, not divided by race or gender or region or home ownership or any of those things. And that is the challenge that the left has faced since the dawn of time. And a big thing that's got in the way of that challenge has been the decline of the Labour movement.
I think the ideas of low-income voters and working class groups not feeling like these institutions represent them is a common sentiment across several countries. And added to that, in the global south, we've had the burden of 2 decades of neoliberalism, which served certain interests, but has culminated in protest movements, as you mentioned in your earlier swell. But Grace, on a positive note, you've espoused the need for a social democratic framework in some of your writings, and the need for increased accessibility and representation for low-income groups. Is there an economic model in your country or elsewhere which has inspired you?
So I think the thing that really inspires me is seeing ordinary people come together and change things, and getting involved in movements and organising and campaigning of all kinds. So, for example, in the UK, there's some really great stuff being done at the local level in some local councils who've pioneered this model of community wealth building, where basically the council itself is saying we're going to use our budget to boost local businesses, to create cooperatives, community banking, and also distribute control to residents to help them, to allow them to kind of decide what they want to see from their local council. Things like participatory budgeting that have taken place in some cities in Spain and Brazil and various other parts of the world, which I think is really cool. It's, citizens in a local area work together to set the budget for their place. Equally, the labour movement organising, trade unions organising and winning battles as they have, more times in recent years than we've seen over the last 30 years, really. The labour movement, while still somewhat on the back foot, is getting more powerful, and they are winning every now and again. And actually, some of the most exciting organising is taking place in the gig economy and the care economy, with people who've maybe traditionally not been included in traditional models of organising. Then looking at people organising to resist climate breakdown. So Fridays for the Future, which is amazing. It's just young kids deciding we're not going to go to school on Fridays, we're going to protest the fact that our politicians aren't doing anything about climate breakdown. Equally, Extinction Rebellion, who, I don't agree with everything they've done, but they've really shined a spotlight on this issue of climate breakdown. Black Lives Matter, fighting against police violence in the UK. All of these are examples of just people working together and coming together to change the way the world works. And if you ask anyone who's involved in those movements, they will say, well, you know, they may not say that it was amazingly successful or, you know, that it was difficult, but I think a lot of people will say that it gives them a sense that it is possible to change things, and that by working together, that becomes so much easier. Because the real challenge that we face today isn't necessarily the availability of alternatives, because there are so many alternative ideas as to how we can organise our society. The challenge we have is that most people don't believe that things could be different. Even when things are really, really bad, people just don't believe that things could be different. And part of that is not believing that human beings can work together to build different ways and models of organising society. But by organising, you realise, oh wait, I can actually work with other people to do this stuff, and can create really big changes in doing so.